a slight change to the programme. You would have noticed that Emily Robertson turned up about an hour ago, but sadly she'd pinched a nerve and she didn't think she could speak. Luckily, we have a first reserve, and that is Aaron Pegram. So just pretend to be Emily.
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm not Emily. My name is Aaron Pegram. I work at the Australian War Memorial. I'm going to talk to you not about propaganda, but about captivity on the Western Front, specifically relating to the Australian experience of captivity on the Western Front. Here's some of those battle-depleted, battle-hardened guys of the 4th Australian Division that Luke was talking about. This is a German photograph of Australian prisoners being led to the rear following the very costly and unsuccessful attack at Bullecourt on the 11th of April 1917. And these guys represented 1,148 Australians captured in that single engagement on that very day. And that was the largest single loss of Australian troops as prisoners of war until the fall of Singapore in February 1942. We don't know anything about their wartime experiences, largely because 3,848 Australians who were taken prisoner on the Western Front largely survived the war. Much of what we know about the Australian prisoner of war experience is based on the Second World War. And that's largely because of the fact that there's so many Australians taken prisoner, not just in the fighting in Europe during the Second World War, but also in the Asia and Pacific, and the very horrific experience that the guys who were captured by the Japanese endure in Japanese captivity. And their horrific stories and their horrific ordeal, and that's borne out by the mortality rate of over 8,000 deaths. It really does bring to the fore a certain bias towards how Australians remember the notion of what it's like to be a prisoner of war. When I began my research, historians in Britain were discussing captivity in the First World War being a missing paradigm. And it was quite fortunate because I then wrote a PhD which helped flesh that out. And in that time, historians such as Heather Jones, Oliver Wilkinson, as well as a number of Richard Nachtigall, other historians overseas started fleshing out the transnational approach to captivity during the First World War, which left nationalist historians, or like historians in Australia, to look at the Australian experience. Dr. Kate Ariotti from the University of Newcastle did an excellent job on fleshing out the detail of the 200 Australians taken prisoner by the Turks, as did Dr. Jennifer Lawless. And so much of the historical attention in recent years has been on those 200 guys grabbed by the Turks on Gallipoli, in Mesopotamia, fighting in the Dardanelles, and of course the fighting in the Middle East, which left me to write about the vast majority who were taken prisoner on the Western Front by troops of the Imperial German Army. What I find interesting about these guys is just how so few of them are captured. There's something like 295,000 Australians who serve on the Western Front. There's 45,000 Australians who are killed, about 125,000 wounded, yet just 4,000 are taken prisoner by the Germans. Why is that so? It's largely because of the fact that on the Western Front, conditions are static. In order to become a prisoner of war, you need to come face-to-face in contact with your enemy. You need to be in physical distance with your enemy. And for much of the war, that doesn't really occur. Most of the Australians who were taken prisoner by the Germans are captured at Fromelles in July 1916 and at Bullecourt in 1917, Dernancourt in 1918. These are actions that involve close quarters fighting. What's interesting when you have a look at the capture of Australian troops on the Western Front, by mid-1917, there's significantly fewer of them are falling into German hands. Why? Because the Allied armies, the British Army in particular, are well adept at, they have increased firepower and have the technological means to bite large chunks into German-occupied territory and hold it against German counterattack. So German infantry doctrine, for example, German infantry tactics play a direct role in the capture of Australian troops. It's largely through counterattacks. So how do these guys fare in German captivity? Well, relatively well. I mean, we had a look at those posters in Megan's talk about the beastly German Hun and what he did to French and Belgian libraries and sinking merchant ships and all that sort of stuff. There was a great anxiety about how German troops or German forces would treat British prisoners of war. I can largely say that their German treatment of prisoners of war was neither brutal nor benign, but somewhere in between. So the treatment of prisoners in the First World War was largely predicated on the 1907 Hague Convention, which largely shaped the conditions for prisoners during the First World War. Also, the 1906 Geneva Convention on the treatment of wounded. That is, enemy forces who'd fall into the other belligerent hands would receive medical treatment. That actually fares particularly well for Australian prisoners of war. In accordance with the Hague Convention, Australian officers who fall into German hands go to a specific officers' camp. They're not made to work. They receive a wage from the Germans. They can even have a batman. And so they largely spend most of their war enclosed in a rather lavish, rather comfortable prisoner of war camp, far from the violence of the front line. Other ranks could be put to work. And so they were. There's 2.5 million Allied prisoners in Germany by 1918, the vast majority of whom are out in the German countryside working. Most of the German men of military age are either in the military, fighting on multiple fronts. The German wartime economy, which has been geared up towards fighting a short war of mobility in 1914, is expanded and stretched to its utter limits to fighting a war on multiple fronts for up to 4 years. The Royal Navy is blockading Germany, preventing vital foodstuffs and fertilisers from coming into the country. That German wartime economy is coming at the expense of the domestic needs of the civilian people. As British prisoners of war in Germany, Australians fare particularly well because the Germans allow external aid agencies such as the Red Cross to send prisoners of war regular food parcels. Part of the research I've been looking at is the role of the Red Cross in not only just finding missing men who turn up in Germany as prisoners of war, but also feeding them. This is largely a voluntary aid effort conducted by Australian women, both at home in Australia and in London. The Australians in Germany receive fortnightly consignments of food parcels. In fact, officers receive anywhere up to 100 kilos of tinned goods per month, which is probably a damn sight better than the guys on the Western Front were receiving. So much so, the Australians receive so much food that they actually are better fed in German captivity than your average German civilian, which is quite interesting. Quite interesting dynamic when guys are trading cigarettes and tinned goods in exchange for things like cigarettes, campfire, or wood for a campfire, sex. Yeah. So I mean, just in this limited time that I've had available and this brief ramble, already the nature of captivity in the First World War challenges what we know or what Australians perceive to be part of the Australian prisoner of war experience. So I think what I find interesting about captivity, particularly on the Western Front, is that of those 3,848 guys who were taken prisoner by the Germans, all but 230 of them survive and return home, which is fairly interesting. The mortality rate in German captivity for Australians is remarkably low, and those guys who do die in German captivity mainly do so from gunshot and fragmentation wounds received in combat immediately behind the German front line. So, statistically, when we have a look at the statistics of Australian combat casualties versus those of the mortality rates of Australians in German captivity, it turns out that Germany is a far safer place to be than actually in the trenches of the Western Front. Okay, so where to from here? Right, well, my research, which I'm turning into a book, hopefully with Cambridge University Press, Peter, is obviously looks at the First World War. But where I want to take it is the connection with the Second World War. So what lessons are learned from the Australian experience or the British experience of captivity in the First, and to take it to the Second. And to use two examples, looking at the issues of intelligence gathering from prisoners of war and also through the escape. Looking at German records, the German intelligence material, we know that Australian prisoners who did not receive any instructions from the War Office or any official guiding rule from the military authorities, when they were interrogated by the German forces, they sang like canaries. And we can talk a little bit more about that probably in question time afterwards. So what happens there between the First World War and the Second? Of course, by the Second World War, your airmen in particular and your soldiers are very well briefed on what to say and do once they fall, if they have the misfortune of falling into the hands of the enemy. Second, escape. Australian prisoners in the First World War did not escape. Why would you? What were you going back to? The Western Front, of course. So that was significantly low. But of course, that all changes in the Second World War, courtesy of the lessons that are born out of the First. So there we go.
Good. Thank you.